As I was listening to the two esteemed speakers for the proposition, Mr. Pinker and Mr. Ridley, by the way, I feel like we should come up with a term for them, a more elegant term. I would suggest maybe we call them the Pollyannas. And since we strangely don't have a woman on stage, which is odd since it's 2015, I thought we could more usefully refer to them as Mr. and Mrs. Pollyanna, and I will leave it to your imagination to figure out who is Mrs. and who is Mr., although I feel like a simple look at the contents of their scalp will give you some indication of which direction is appropriate. In any case, as I was listening to Mr. and Mrs. Pollyanna, my mind wandered, as I'm sure many of your minds wandered as well, and I began to think of all of the possible scenarios under which I would agree with them. And so, for example, suppose we add just 3 words to the proposition: be it resolved that the best days lie ahead for Mr. Pinker and Mr. Ridley. That's absolutely the case. Mr. Ridley is a member of the House of Lords, one of the greatest sinecures in the history of the Western world. Mr. Pinker is on the faculty of Harvard University, which might usefully be described as America's answer to the House of Lords. It's absolutely the case their best days lie ahead. No one's going to dispute that. Or suppose we were debating, be it resolved that Canada's best days lie ahead. Absolutely true. You just had a massive upgrade at the leadership position. But sadly, not all of us live in Canada. I live in the United States. One only has to watch 5 minutes of the Republican presidential debates to know that that proposition is decidedly not true for those people south of the border. But perhaps most seriously, and I'm going to get to the point here, if this proposition was, be it resolved that humankind's best days historically have lain ahead, I think the answer is absolutely yes. And that is exactly what my two opponents have done. They have beautifully made the case that if we go back into the past and we project forward to the 18th century, the 17th century, the 19th century, 1950, 1975, and we fast forward to the present day, things have been on an upward trajectory. And I think we can all say that's absolutely the case. But this debate's not about the past, right? It's about the future. It's about whether things get better from this point going forward. And what I want to say is that the notion that the future is going to get better is hopelessly naive. And the word better is misplaced. What we really, I think, are facing when we look at the future is a future that's different. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I was recently at a conference and I was chatting with some people in the who were security specialists, internet security specialists. And I said, what do you worry about? What's on your mind? And they said, well, you know, we've done a very good job recently at dealing with the everyday, low-level threats that used to comprise the world of hacking. The guy from Bulgaria who wants to steal your credit card, right? There's thousands of those threats. We're doing a good job of keeping them at bay. But what terrifies us is what they called digital 9/11, right? Some nation state comes in, hacks their way into the electrical infrastructure of North America and shuts off the power for a week. That terrifies them. Or someone goes in, hacks into 1,000 cars simultaneously on the 401 and causes a massive traffic jam and car accident. Now, that might not be substantially different from the way the 401 is present time, but it would come as something of a shock. Or another example, I'll just give you a series of random examples. There are so many of these, I could go on and on for many minutes, but not long ago I was reading a paper in a political science journal, and it was all about the impact of cell phone use in Africa, and pointed out that the introduction of cell phones in Africa has had an extraordinary effect on the lives of ordinary Africans, right? It's permitted them to do all kinds of things they could never do in the past. But at the same time, it is absolutely the case that the introduction of cell phones has made the job of coordinating and executing actions and military operations by terrorist groups like ISIS and Boko Haram a lot easier than it was in the past. Or let me give you another example. It's absolutely the case that our ability over the last 25, 50 years to deal with what might be called ordinary climate crises has gotten an awful lot better. I don't fear, nor do most people fear famine today in the same way that we might have feared it 25 years ago. Our ability to come up with disease-resistant or drought-resistant crops, our ability to come up with much more effective desalination technologies have meant that the threat of that kind of environmental crisis is absolutely receding. But if you talk to a climate expert, that's not what they're worried about. They look at what just happened in Mexico, where we had one of the biggest and most ferocious hurricanes ever recorded, and they say, we look at warming trends around the world in the world's oceans, we're worried that one of those mega hurricanes is going to come along and deliver a blow the likes of which we've never seen before, right? The powerful engine of human activity is what allows us to create drought and famine-resistant crops, but it's also what's driving climate change, which is a risk of a whole nother order. Now, what do all these examples have in common? What they tell us is that as a society, we have been engaged not in the reduction of risk, but in the reconfiguration of risk. You don't have to worry about a famine every 5 years, but you have to worry about a mega hurricane coming along and wiping out Miami. You don't have to worry about a guy in Romania stealing your credit card, but you have to worry about North Korea coming in and shutting off the power for 2 weeks. Right? And having a cell phone in Africa means that your life is a lot easier than it would have been 5 or 10 years ago. But it also means that the threat to you from terrorist groups is greater and more pervasive than it would have been 5 or 10 years ago. So what does that mean for our friends, Mr. and Mrs. Pollyanna? Well, it means that everything they told you is true. It's all true. I sat there listening to the two of them, nodding my head and saying, you couldn't have spoken more truthfully and realistically and honestly about the trajectory of all these different trends. But it's only half the story, right? To my mind, what this debate is really about is whether the change in the nature of the risks that we face is something that ought to scare us. And I think the answer is obvious. It should.